They need to say whether they do it for the Chhattisgarh, for instance, they did the wanted to call automatic user and improve their notification after the day because there was a backlash. So we don't know, and we have to see. But like I said, if we have to respond to this emergency, and because of the lack of time, currently the
Hello?
private sector will have to be brought in. Only the government might not be able to do it.
Can you hear me?
So we have to see how this pans out, but that's very difficult. The private sector, health sector, and from Ravi, I'm not very hopeful, but that should hopefully be the direction. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also a broader context and see. For instance, in Spain, the city overall, New York, governments, so coordinate private and public hospitals, and we see there is, in a sense, a certain kind of regulatory approach and audit approach being coordinated. So there's a very strong role for the state and activities. This is also a important kind of we the policy in place. Talking about the broader context, the climate change scenario has been forward, whether in a sense that how it is system to sustain to a lot of code production.
Yeah, so actually, it's like you're saying, I think the question is relevant not just for India but the economy overall also. Because we have to address the crisis of the lockdown period as well. The entire livelihood question. There is, I can't know any effective way of doing it without the state coming back with a major way. The current neoliberal kind of thing, people not able to achieve government crisis as well. And this is not a 21 day people have gone to share people back to normal. That is not going to happen. And globally also there is this push. So there is a hope and hope also because I think that's the only way forward. But I'm less hopeful about how much will build every because there is. But for instance, say other advanced countries that economic packages somewhere from 5 to 15% of their GDP. Our state has announced 0.5% of GDP. It's refusing to spend. It's refusing to give money to state government. So we are a long way to go for that. And our bailout might still be focused on GDP. I wrote this question. It's very new topic, but I just give a short answer because you asked it on the identity page. There was a focus on it prior to 1992. Uh, it goes back all the way back to the approach to the education, higher education was higher education. Similarly, but timing not given that kind of attention or was given attention. It also is to do with the fact that additionally the issue that health has been right now in the state and the central government looking at family planning in the country. So family planning is something that they really focus on and really helps to equate it to population control, and that is what happened during the 80s or more. Mainly, what we did do when we choose single programs with very different graduates, and that is smallpox with education. Malaria control had to last, now polio is eradicated. The central government has also taken this kind of vertical. This health system vision is there came much later. There was 1980 and about 19. But by the time you that to happen, you had the all-time was selling in the early 90s, looking at the market-based agenda, and then all the happening. But overall, I think that's been part of the economy, early planning period in India, which is similar to Thank you.
Hello. Let's begin with this special session on the impact of the lockdown and the coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus outbreak on Indian agriculture. Some of the things that about the COVID-19 and the following response to it by the government and lockdown is already very clear and it is already playing out. We don't know how long will the lockdown go. It may go further or it may be relaxed a little bit. And we also know how the people are responding. I mean, there is already a kind of a humanitarian crisis that has unfolded. The migrants heading back to their villages is something that was obviously there in the news. Most of the state governments are struggling with providing basic necessities to the people, particularly those who are informal sector workers or unorganized sector workers. But one sector or one set of people who have not yet got the same kind of an attention are the people who are there in the rural areas, partly because the virus has not yet penetrated the rural areas in that big way, and it is not yet being felt to that extent. But once it reaches, I think it will be a humongous exercise to control it once it reaches in the rural areas. Not just because it's going to be a health crisis, given the state of health affairs which is there in the rural areas, but also because a large part of the livelihood or large part of the informal workers who are going back to the villages will be there, and the loss of livelihood and loss of activity or income will put additional burden on the rural areas, or particularly people in agricultural sector. So I think the humanitarian crisis that is going to unfold once it reaches the rural areas is certainly a bigger health crisis than what we have seen so far. But I think even without that, for the time being, if we forget what is going to happen in the rural areas, if the virus outbreak reaches the rural areas, the fact that the lockdown has been going on and it is going to continue until the middle of this month and may go on further after that, it already is creating a kind of a problem or kind of an economic crisis in the rural economy, much more in the those who are engaged in agriculture directly as well as indirectly. And I think that's the kind of an issue that we wanted to discuss in today's discussion. Let me begin by saying that the Indian agriculture is already in crisis, and that is something which we are more or less aware of it. Last 2 years have seen Indian agriculture stagnation of wages, and in some cases declining rural wages, and those are the issues which none of them have disappeared. What the virus the outbreak has done is kind of put those questions in the back burner because of the lockdown and because of the evolving situation in the current area. But that does not mean that those issues which were there already in the rural economy have disappeared. And those are more or less issues which also were responsible for the impact that had on the overall economy with the growth rates slowing down. So keep that in the background, keep that in the context. None of those issues have been taken care of. So economy was going into a slowdown, driven by declining incomes in the rural areas. In the agriculture sector, there's a crisis which is already there, and those things will continue to be important even in the long run as the lockdown unfolds or the strategy of fighting the coronavirus unfolds over a period of time. So how is it impacting the agricultural sector or the rural sector broadly in that sense? Because although people working in agriculture remain roughly around half of the total population, but large number of population in the rural areas or even those who are dependent on agriculture are getting incomes from non-agricultural sector also. So it's not just the agrarian economy, but also the non-agrarian economy, which has been affected in a big way and which will have an impact on agriculture directly or indirectly. Large number of migrant workers going back to the rural areas, or because of the disruption in services sector or in the unorganized sector in the urban areas, the pressure on the rural areas to provide jobs will be much more than what it was there, say 2 months back or 6 months back. So I think those things are already there, and those we have to take into account. But if you're specifically looking at the agricultural sector, then there are two questions which I think important, and those questions can be broken down into two different aspects of the agrarian economy. One is the short-term question, and the short-term question is basically related to what is going to happen to agriculture given the lockdown. When the labor is tied down, it is not allowed to move freely to the farms or from one state to another state. Remember, this month, April month, is the month where most of the Rabi harvests are done. And this is also a month where labor utilization is at its peak, not just for harvesting, but also for processing, for packaging, for taking the transportation, the taking the food grains, taking the or other kind of agricultural produce to the mandis, selling them, and those kind of things. So this is a peak labor demand period that we are talking about. And it is this point of time when labor is not able to move to the agricultural fields, it is going to have an impact on the Rabi harvest in not just the surplus producing states of, say, for example, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, and those states, Madhya Pradesh, but also in states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, where these laborers would go back to their home during this harvest period and basically contribute to the labor which was required at this point of time. Now, that is something which is stuck now, and that labor is not going to be mobile for some time. And given the lack of labor which is available in most of these states, there is really a serious problem of availability of labor and the whole harvesting process and what will happen to the post-harvest operations, which are again very, very important. For food grains, they may not be that important, but for perishable crops, they're seriously important. Once the crop is harvested, there is definitely this is something which needs to be done. It has to be processed. It has to be sold to the markets. It is something cannot be stored at home. Farmers do not have that much of storage space to store that much of perishable crops, particularly fruits and vegetables. And remember, these are now the bigger items of agricultural produce, much larger than the food grain economy, which consists only of the cereals and the pulses. And the second short-term problem, which again is going to be a problem which is not going to be resolved so easily, is what we are going to do in terms of the produce that has come out of it, and whether we are able to take this produce to the markets, even if it is, for example, harvested and processed. And that is happening simply because the supply chains have been completely broken. So trucks are not moving. The shopkeepers are not able to access the produce which has already been harvested, has been packaged, and is ready for transportation. So the transport network is not working. The supply chains have been broken, and there in this particular situation, the short-term impact of on the agricultural income, particularly because this remember this is the time when the farmers get their income. So throughout the period of Rabi period, from November onwards up to March, they keep spending money, right from sowing to putting fertilizer and irrigation. This is the time when the money is realized, when the basically when the money comes to the farmer's hand. And if there is a delay in getting the money in the farmer's hand, it also means that the liability of the farmer in terms of paying back their loans that they have taken or other kind of commitment that they have made is going to be affected. So this is going to be a double a whammy for the farmers who are waiting for the produce to come back to be sold and the money to be realized from the agricultural operations. So I think these are the short-term issues that will be obviously important and they need to be dealt with. The second, I think, is and far more important is the question that has been lingering on with the Indian economy or Indian agriculture for quite some time, and that is the fact that the agricultural terms of trade have moved against agriculture, which is that the agricultural prices are rising much slower compared to the non-agricultural prices, as a result of which the costs have gone up much faster than the price that is realized by selling the produce. So a farmer's income were anyway going down. A result of that was that agricultural wages were going down. They have started declining in real terms. And with the lockdown, not just domestically, but also kind of lockdown in the international markets abroad, the demand decline that is going to happen in international markets, there is already evidence of international commodity prices collapsing. That has happened in petroleum prices, but it is also happening in most of the agricultural commodities. Now, if most of the agricultural commodity, the prices are collapsing in international market, they will have an impact in the Indian domestic market also. But otherwise also, because the incomes are going to fall, demand of the food commodities is going to be much lower than what was there. And this will basically mean that the agricultural prices are going to go down much much faster than what we have seen in the last 2 years. So I think there is a problem, and this long-term problem of the uh, uh, prices coming down uh, is something which is going to hurt the Indian agriculture for next 6 months, 1 year, or maybe longer than that, unless the government takes up some kind of an effort to increase incomes in the rural hands or increase take some kind of a fiscal expenditure program to increase incomes in the economy. And this is something which is linked to the overall growth of the economy. So if the economy is going to be in a recession, this impact on the agricultural demand is certainly is going to translate into lower prices and again lower incomes. So we are in a bad situation if these things don't work. Now, the questions that the one of the questions that has come from Vijay is basically talking about the cash transfers, which are reaching to the farmer which has been announced as part of the fiscal stimulus. Now, at this particular point of time, lockdown is a necessity, and that seems to be the only way of trying to prevent the spread of the virus, which basically means that there is no way the supply chains are going to be improved or to be restored to their normal process. Now, how do you end up helping the farmers or putting incomes in the hands of the farmers? Now, cash transfers are the only possible way, not the best way of helping them. There are definitely multiple ways in which the government can intervene and help reset the agricultural economy. But the cash transfers that have been announced so far by the government on the 25th March press conference, that is only the first installment of the PM Kisan. And remember, that is only 2,000 rupees, and it goes only to people who are having some kind of land. It doesn't cover the landless people. It doesn't cover the wage workers. It doesn't cover the tenant farmers and many other categories of people who are dependent on agriculture, not directly but indirectly. And even with all this, the track record of the implementation of the PM Kisan in the last 1 year, if you go by the budget itself, then that was allocated 75,000 crores. We ended up spending only around 53,000 crores. So as against a target of 12 crore people who need to be paid the PM Kisan, we only could pay only 8 crore households the PM Kisan installments. So I think this is something which is PM Kisan is something which is one way of helping the farmers, giving them the first installment, but it is not over and above what is already supposed to be given to them. So I think what is needed right now is not just to give them more money than what is required. Obviously, the 2,000 rupees that is being given to a farming households, which covers roughly, given the size of a four-member households, is 500 rupees per member. That's something simply not enough. And not only it has to be increased, but it has to be increased by a substantial amount of time. Most of the farmers who would have taken loan to uh, cultivate crops, commercial crops, as well as the food crops, will have their pending dues which need to be paid immediately. And this is something that they were waiting for. So this amount that is going to be given to them is not even going to take care of the consumption needs of the most of the farmers. So I think there is a need to increase the amount of money that is going to go through the PM Kisan and many fold. But I think the most important question, which is where the question comes in, is how are these money income transfers going to help people who are landless farmers or tenant farmers, which again is a reality, or the wage workers who are dependent on agricultural work. They were supposed to work in the harvesting season and get their wages. Or, for example, people who are going to work in MG, Narega, and other kind of wage work programs. So I think those are the people who are going to be suffering more. So this is the time where this kind of an initiative should not only go to people who are owning land, but also people who are not in a position to provide any kind of proof of having done any cultivation, or so, for example, tenant farmers, or for example, people who are, say, wage workers, landless laborers, landless farmers. All of these should be given the income transfers, and in a much larger scheme. This is something on which there is a consensus. Almost every economist, whether in India or outside, has said that this is the only way of helping the agrarian economy or the rural economy. This is important not just for the short run to provide some kind of income to the people in the rural economy, but it is also important for reviving demand for the overall growth of the economy. And if that is not something which is done immediately, there is an urgency. There is a sense of urgency that we need to follow, and we need to continue doing it till the time the demand revives, or till the time there is the lockdown situation or social distancing norms are going to be stricter in the economy. I think the question of shifting to food grains at this point of time is not something which is very relevant at this point of time. Remember, this cultivation season is over, and probably we are going to have the next cultivation season starting in July, which is the Kharif season, which is going to start. We are talking about what is going to happen for the next 3 to 4 months. That's something which is an immediate necessity. But I think the larger question that Sainath is pointing out is the question of food becoming an important constraint, not just for the domestic economy, but also for the globally. And there are concerns that have been raised by the Food and Agricultural Organization that the food economy may see a completely different kind of a problem. With incomes falling, food riots are going to become a problem. There is obviously a coordination failure with movement of food grains also being restricted from rural areas to urban areas. I think those are issues which are important. Fortunately, we are in a situation where the government is sitting on a huge amount of food grain stocks. We have roughly like 77 million tons of food grains which are lying in the government godowns, and those are much higher, almost 4 times the requirement by the government of India, which is roughly 21 million tons required on the 1st of April. Now, the food grains that were generally accumulated because this happens generally before the election year, where the government's purchases much more than what is required, and they keep on adding to the stocks, but they don't distribute to the population simply because that adds to the fiscal deficit. This is the right time to open the godowns and distribute as much as the government can in the next 4 to 5 months. Even if you go for say more cultivation of food grains, say from July onwards, remember that produce is going to come to the market only in October, November, not before that. So we have a long 7, 8 months period where people will not be able to afford basic food. And this is the time when the mistakes that we committed in terms of building up the stocks is something that is going to be helpful in resolving the issue of food. So we need to expand this coverage of the public distribution system, as the government has promised that they will also be providing some kind of additional food grain for the next 3 months. Probably they'll be required to give it for the next 6 months, and also give pulses, which are again lying in stocks but have not been distributed by the government so far. We need to do all these, and these are also important because if the government has to increase prices and has to provide income support to the farmers, one way of doing it is to by providing them minimum support prices. And the only way you can do provide income support by using the minimum support prices is by going and directly procuring from the farmers. That is paying money to the farmers in the hands of the farmers. But if you do that, you need to take that stock which you procured and put them in the go down. But all our go downs are now overflowing. So the distribution strategy which has been worked out and probably has to be taken it for the for a longer duration, maybe 6 months or 9 months or maybe for entire year, so that at least people do not die of hunger and starvation, even if they are saved from coronavirus. What is required is to expand the distribution network, give it the more amount of food grain that more than the entitlement that is available in the public distribution system. But it is also important because this will free up the space which has currently been there in the currently no space is available in the our go downs, and this will basically where the current procurement process can bring in more and more food and can be then put in the go downs. But that will require the government not just to expand the public distribution system, expand by quantity of food that is going to be given, but also expand it by making it universal. A large number of migrants which are now going from urban areas to rural areas or from one state to another state will have a problem accessing the public distribution system, because we still do not have the portability of ration cards, which is like if you are a migrant in Maharashtra, you can't access your food grains in Bihar. So this is the time when the government should actually be relaxing these conditions and allowing everybody, even those without the ration card, to access the food grains as much as possible, as much as they can. Or, for example, right from giving them say 10 kgs per family, or 10 kgs or 20 kgs per family, depending on the family size. But I think the criteria should be expanded and made it completely universal for the next at least 1 year, till the time there is this crisis is unfolding, or the economy is not in a position to revive demand for the agricultural commodities. The sustainability of the as far as the entire process is concerned, depending on the lockdown, is again a question which is very hypothetical question. We still do not know how long will the lockdown be. As of now, the lockdown is going to end on 14th of April, but there are indications, at least there is some kind of a discussion going on, that the lockdown may be extended by some more time, maybe a week, or maybe some people are saying maybe by a month. We don't know as of now. But yes, the longer the lockdown, the longer the misery of the people who are dependent uh, uh, on organized sector, dependent on agricultural sector, and we are talking about roughly 70-75% of the population, directly or indirectly, which will who are dependent on some kind of income from the agricultural sector. Obviously, people who are directly involved in agriculture are an important category of it, but a large number of them who are involved in food processing industry. For example, people who are selling vegetables, or people who are selling juices, or all sorts of other things, or involved in food processing industries. That's a large category of workers that we're talking about, and most of these workers are at the bottom end of the distribution. A majority of these workers, particularly wage laborers, but also small and they do not have the staying power or the capacity. Very few of them are regular workers, so they're going to directly get engaged in the casual labor market, and therefore their staying power without regular flow of income is going to be very low. And if that is the case, then I think any extension of the lockdown will have serious repercussion on people's ability to purchase food grains. And again, I would like to remind the background, give you a reminder of the background, that the last data that we had in 2017-18 for the consumption expenditure survey, that data was very clear that we had a real decline in food consumption. So people's consumption of food in real terms is already declining. And at this point of time, when their incomes are going to go down further, this was going to lead to a much bigger humanitarian crisis than the coronavirus crisis that we're looking at. I mean, there is no doubt that there will be going to be further slowdown in the economy. But I think the rural-urban market dichotomy is a very, very weird dichotomy in a sense, at least in the short run, what we are going to see. And this is entirely happening simply because of the supply chains completely disrupted, is that there might be a temporarily rise in prices in the urban areas simply because the food grains and the food commodities or agricultural commodities will not be able to reach the urban markets. And as a result of that, there might be a rise in prices in the urban areas, but at the same time, there will be a decline in prices in the rural areas simply because people will not be able to sell their produce to the traders, to the mandis, or to the directly to the people. So you will have a very peculiar situation, which was already going on for some time. Last year, for 6 months, this was a situation which did exist, that the urban inflation was much higher, whereas the rural inflation was much lower. So we are again going to face this situation where the urban inflation will pattern will is completely opposite compared to the rural inflation pattern. But the end result of all this will be that the slowdown in the economy is definitely going to be uh, stronger. It is going to be longer for the economy to recover from the slowdown, come back to the normal situation. And the agriculture sector in the rural areas, even though they're smaller in terms of the size of the economy, their contribution to the GDP, because they affect a large number of people who are earning their income from there, they do affect the non-agricultural demand as well. I mean, people who are buying mobiles or cycles or getting into services sector, their incomes are dependent on agriculture sector. So there is going to be a spillover, or there is some transmission of demand decline from the rural areas, agricultural sector to the non-agricultural sector. So I think this will definitely going to affect the agriculture sector much more. I mean, the overall economy in the long run, at least for the next 1 or 2 years. But really, I think that also something which is again, if you go back to the discussion that generally was there before the budget was presented, I think everybody was agreeing that India is now going through a demand crisis, and as a result of that, and if you remember, consumption growth was slowest. It has come down to the slowest rate in the last 10 to 15 years. Overall consumption growth was down, and I think the reviving demand was the solution that was being prescribed even before the coronavirus outbreak had happened. I think before the budget, a lot of discussion was talking about that the government should be giving some kind of stimulus, reviving the rural demand, increasing demand in the rural areas. While it was important at that point of time, it is even more important now. I mean, it's something which is absolute necessity now, Now, if you do not do that, this is something which is end up into a bigger humanitarian crisis. And forget about economic revival, because the three sources of demand, I think the rural areas demand is obviously not going to be picking up. But even external demand, which or exports, which we are hoping to work out, that is not going to happen because the global economy is going to be in recession for some time. And I think if there is no demand revival that is happening, then there is no way the economy is going to recover. And this is an absolute necessity. I think ENAM is something which was basically it's something which is going on for quite some time. I mean, the electronic national agricultural markets is something which has been under discussion for quite some time, and even the UPA government tried to connect the uh, mandis which are in different states through the some kind of electronic platform. But let me tell you, this particular government, the NDA government, did try its electronic platform. But let me tell you, this particular government, the NDA government, did try its best to have a national agricultural market. But again, one has to understand the reality of agriculture markets to get an understanding of whether enam can work or enam cannot work. Even without the pandemic, even if you're looking at, say, for example, the data that we have for the last year, the electronic transactions or the transactions which were happening through the enam were only a small fraction of the total amount of grain transaction or the mandis transaction that were happening. I mean, less than 5% or 5% of the total transactions were going through the enam. In some commodities, in some crops, these were happening on a much larger scale. But at least overall, if you look at the market where finished goods are there, the electronic markets, agricultural markets do not work on electronic uh, platforms so well, simply because farmers or the buyers are not so sure about the quality of the produce. I mean, you would not like to buy onions by looking at the photographs of onions. I mean, whereas if you're buying, say, for example, iPhone, there is a standard element of iPhone that is available. So just by without looking at the element, you can buy it. But most people would like to buy stuff, and therefore that is true for traders as well. So the quality and the produce, those are things on which it is very important to the physical presence is very important. That is why the electronic markets have not worked so far. And I don't think the enam is something which is going to work again. And remember, it is also about transportation of it. Even if you buy it electronically, somebody has to deliver the food grains or the grapes or uh, onions or potatoes or tomatoes to the market yards or to the bigger places. So the supply chain bottlenecks will continue to play a bigger role and will have an impact on what is going to happen in the as price realization for farmers is concerned. Again, I mean, this is something which is very difficult to predict as to where the food crisis is going to be severe. I mean, there are two aspects of it. One is that even the surplus states, they are going to see a sharp drop in price realization. And that is simply because they will not be able to sell it to the mandis. Farmers will not be able to transport it in the mandi. And remember, we are talking about, I mean, large areas and large quantities. I mean, an average farmer for example, in Punjab would have something like say 50 to 60 quintals or 100 quintals of grains which are available. It's not something which is that you just simply go and harvest a plot. It is something which needs to be harvested, has to be processed, has grains which are available. It's not something which is that you just simply go and harvest a plot. It is something which needs to be harvested, has to be processed, has to be packed, has to be taken to the market. So there are all sorts of things which are a part of it. So there is going to be a problem on those ones. But in the eastern states or states which are, say, for example, Bihar, Orissa, and other places, or Madhya Pradesh, where availability of food is dependent, a large part of it is dependent on the through the public distribution system. Not being able to access food grains or the decline in incomes will have an repercussions on people's ability to consume food grains. So I'm not sure whether they're going to be have. I mean, and remember, southern states are definitely food deficit states. So there is going to be a really massive challenge to make sure that food is made available from food surplus states to food deficit states. Now, this is not an easy task, and it requires a coordinated response from the central government as well as the state governments. Whether there are going to be food riots or not, that's a very difficult situation. But certainly, hunger and starvation are going to increase. And if they are going to increase, they will have an repercussion on the broader politics of the state. Well, the direct procurement, I mean, somebody has to procure. I mean, the direct procurement is something which is very easy to say. But remember, I mean, somebody will have to go and put it in the, I mean, buy it from the market, take the delivery of the food grains or wherever, whatever produce you are doing it, and then go and do it. See, in some places like in Pune, where the farmers themselves have decided to go and distribute and sell it in the urban areas, that can happen only in some local places. But it can't happen. I mean, if a farmer who is growing, say, for example, tomatoes and has some uh, uh, 50 quintals of tomatoes lying with them, that farmer alone is not going to go and sell it on its own. I mean, it will need the supply chain, and that supply chain includes middlemen. It does include wholesalers. It doesn't include other people who will be sorting it out or then packing it and giving those things. Now, those are things which are not easily replaceable. I mean, you can't simply have new sets of people doing the same kind of a job that was being done by, and these are specialized people. I mean, this is not something that I or you can go and simply start getting engaged in the market. So I think there is a problem, and even if the government has to go and direct procurement from the farmers, we are talking about millions of farmers. And for any government organization, when the government is not able to reach millions of peoples, even to deliver the food grains which is available in the stocks, going and dealing with a small number of farmers, I mean, an average village will have some 100 farmers or 200 farmers. It's something which is not feasible, practically feasible for the government machinery to do it. So I think that's why the mandis are playing an important role. The markets will have to play an important role of being the aggregators where the farmers bring in the produce and the people who are uh, the middlemen or the wholesalers are buying from those middlemen. So I think these are options which are there where the government can intervene, make the process smooth, can provide certain kind of relaxation to the agricultural markets, and they have promised that there will be some relaxations which are available. But again, this message has not gone down to the local level. So I don't think the local district authorities are as flexible as the central government or the state government, the senior bureaucracy, which understands the problem of these supply chains. I think one must remember that seeds. We are dealing with a number of crops. Each one of them have their own complications, and we don't know what kind of demand which is there. I mean, if somebody is going to do it, government's MSP operations, for example, or the procurement operations are restricted only to rice and wheat, and to certain extent now in the case of pulses. But these are only three crops that we are talking about. Rest of the crops, I don't think there is any procurement mechanism which is there, or there is any mechanism as to how, even if the government decides to procure, they don't know how to handle it. I mean, the government has no idea what to do with if the government tomorrow decides and say procures 200,000 tons of potatoes or something else. So that I think the mechanism itself is not available, and that makes it difficult for the government to intervene in any other crop other than these basic crops. I think it is not a labor surplus problem. I mean, the migrant problem is really the underbelly, which was everybody was aware of it, but nobody was talking about it. And I think we have ignored this issue for quite a long period of time. And the government's own statement in the Supreme Court is that roughly like 5 lakh to 6 lakh people are moving, migrants are moving back to their own home state from the urban areas to the rural areas. And it's not a labor service. It's something where the economy has suddenly come to a grinding halt. And this is true for most of the labor, I mean, informal enterprises, unorganized enterprises, which have basically stopped working, as a result of which the migrant workers have been pushed jobless. They have nothing to do. But I think more than this, I think the bigger problem is the mistrust that the migrant population has, or generally the working class has against the government. I mean, if there was a promise by the government that they will be taken care of, they will be provided food, they will be provided shelter, and there is no need for them to walk back to their villages, I think most migrant workers would have stayed back wherever they are. But they all know that once the lockdown starts, and it is going to be longer duration, then I think there is no state support that is going to be available. It also raises questions on the nature of social security support that is available. I mean, you have still the social security net, which is fairly better in the rural areas. You have all sorts of things which are working. But for the urban poor, the fact that you do not have the social security support, and if you lose your job, nobody is going to pay you advance salaries, or there is no income that is going to be available. Your landlord is not going to give you any kind of rebate, or for example, the food is not going to be available if you don't have the ration card. That's the miss. That's where the issues become far more. Example, the food is not going to be available if you don't have the ration card. That's the miss. That's where the issues become far more difficult. So most of the migrants who walked back to the villages, while it was difficult, they definitely a response to the lockdown, but it is also one of the reasons for that was the mistrust or the poor when they're stuck in this kind of a uncomfortable situation. So I think they're still dependent their own family networks, their own village network in the during the at the place of work or at the place of employment, and that raises an important question as to what kind of social safety nets that we have built for migrant workers, which cannot persuade them to stay back for some time. I think the first stimulus package was not even a stimulus package. I mean, a lot of the, I mean, the whole number of the 1.7 lakh crores is a completely misleading number. That number is uh, completely incorrect. I mean, a lot of this, for example, the MG and Narega wage increase was something which was uh, supposed to happen. There's nothing new that the government was doing on that. This was due. This is part of the act that the wages are revised, and the government was not even generous to raise wages more than what was given by the inflation numbers. And building those numbers as part of your financial package is absolutely ridiculous, simply because no worker is going to work on an MG Narega project when the period of lockdown is continuing for the next 1 month or whatever time. So if there is no income that is going to come to MG Narega worker, then raising wages by 20 rupees or raising wages by 200 rupees is absolutely meaningless. I think same is the case with the PM Kisan, where the money was being given to them, which would anyway have been given to them because they were. This is the installment that was the first installment in this particular financial year would have anyway gone to them. So I don't think the government was giving anything extra again on that front. I think the only place where there is some kind of fiscal stimulus is there is the food grains that is being offered, the 5 kg extra free ration that is being offered only to the people who have some kind of entitlement already available. And again, that's a very small number. That's roughly like 30 to 40,000 crore rupees. So that's the only number I can think of as really the stimulus. Again, the 500 rupees as the part of the Jandhan Yojana going to the workers is again a very, very small amount. This is just 2 days of manual work where the people are losing 25 to 30 days of manual work and they are being compensated only for 2 days of manual work is not something which is going to be useful for any household. 500 rupees is not even enough to feed a family of five for 1 day. We're talking about the going to a household. So I think assuming 4 to 5 members in a household, we are only talking about 100 rupees or 150 rupees for every household. So the fiscal stimulus was not there. I mean, it's all so much in the air. And in terms of basic, if you really do the calculations carefully, you realize that the total numbers were less than 70,000 crore rupees is what the government was giving over and above what it was promising to give. This is certainly inadequate. It is less than half of what was given to the corporate sector just 5 months back. I mean, you gave 1.5 lakh crore rupees to the corporate sector when this crisis was not even there and the economy was slowing down. A result of the demand decline happened. Today, we are giving only 70,000 crore rupees, where at least millions of people are moving back to the have lost jobs or at least not going to get income. So the X quantum itself was. Now, how do you go about giving this kind of stimulus package? I mean, there are two, three components which have to be essentially done. Remember, in a lockdown, people are not going to work. So there's labor available. I mean, labor, if they want to work, also will not be, MG Narega works will not be available. So the only way you can do is to give them compensation for not being able to work. They're not able to, it's not that they're not willing to work. They're not able to work because the government is not allowing them to work because of the lockdown that is available, that is stopping people from or social distancing norms, which are forcing people not to work. So I think at least some 20 days or 25 days, which is the normal working month, the number of days for which the average wages should have been given to them. So if you assume 200 rupees to be the average wage of MG Narega worker, you should have given at least 6,000 rupees, a little more than that also. Minimum 6,000 rupees for 20 should have been given to them for the worker, assuming that the husband wife both are going to work. So that's the minimum that the government should have given to them. That's something which is not happening. The government should make the public distribution system completely universal, that anybody and everybody who is in need of food should be given food at the priority basis. The third, I think, is the amount of cash that needs to be given to the farmers. if they are going to suffer income loss simply because there is no buyer in the market for the produce that is there. This is more necessary. This is really urgent for the people who are taken loan from the money lenders. And just to be clear about this, roughly 50% of the total lending in the rural areas or in the agricultural sector is still through non-institutional sources, which is through the money lending or through the money lender. Now, these are at a very, very high rate of interest, and a default of 6 months or 7 months could be really catastrophic to households. So I think the money that is which the farmer would have were expecting at the end of April or the beginning of April should be made available to them. The government should make provisions for procuring those produce at whatever cost is available to them without looking at the fiscal deficit options. But I think the government should bring the supply chain back into work in whatever way without breaking the lockdown that the government can do. I think a lot of things there the government is giving 2 months wages, 3 months wages to everybody who is demanding without looking for any identification or without looking for any kind of proof sector. But I think the vulnerability is also very high. So that is why the government should be giving a bare minimum amount for them to have at least take care of their consumption needs for the next 3 months or 4 months to at least survive for the next 3 4 months. That is, I think, the minimum that the government should have done. And I hope that the next fiscal stimulus, which is being talked about, would at least talk about giving a larger amount of payout to and to larger set of people who are going to be affected by this lockdown. But I think the government also must think about doing reviving the economy in the long run, because while these are short-term measures and emergency measures, these can take you further for next 2 months, 3 months, or maybe 4 months. But ultimately, the shock that the agricultural economy is going to get by the decline in agricultural prices is going to be far more serious. And there has to be an economy strategy of raising prices by providing remunerative prices to farmers for the crops for which they are going to grow. Otherwise, it will have an impact of actually acreage coming down. People will stop cultivating, and that will have an impact on the food prices. So I think the long-term process is not something which is dealing from what is happening in the agriculture sector, and it is a long-term worry which has to be dealt. It depends. I mean, the fiscal stimulus is definitely necessary, and how long is a question which is depends on how the situation evolves. If the crisis deepens and if the problem persists for a longer period of time, then I think the government may have to continue the fiscal stimulus for longer than the 3 4 months that we are talking about. As of now, at least for the short run or for the immediate at this point of time, at least for the next 6 months, there should be a fiscal stimulus that should continue. Because I remember, I mean, the next crop cycle where farmers are going to get a better income or will have a better source of income coming from sustain himself or herself. But for the time being, I think next 3 months are crucial, and the fiscal stimulus is not just for agriculture, but I think the overall rural economy is very, very important for the overall economy to survive and, in a sense, come back to normal. So let me try and summarize the discussion so far. I think, I mean, agriculture sector is something which is going to be affected as the overall economy, and I don't think there is uh, any doubt about it that the given the uh, given that the even the developed countries are expecting a kind of a recession in their economy. it is going to affect the Indian economy. But the difference between the developed world and the developing, I mean, at least Indian case, is that unlike other countries, we were already in a precarious situation. I mean, and most people, say, for example, trying to compare it with the 2008 financial crisis and the current crisis. The 2008 financial crisis happened at a time when we had 4 years of good economic run. I mean, the growth rate was very high, monsoon was very well, and really a disastrous economic performance. And if you look at what has happened to the in the last 3 years, particularly after the demonetization, the GST, the brunt of the adjustment has been borne by the informal sector and the poorer section of the households, including the rural sector and the agricultural sector. And that is why, if these are the people who are basically going to be affected, and these have been already been affected in the last 3 4 years, their ability to survive one or two shocks has also been taken away. And so they're really in a very, very precarious situation. So I think that makes it all the more challenging for the government to revive the agriculture sector and the rural economy. And there's unrest in agriculture sector was becoming more and more vocal and more vociferous. But while those were vociferous and they were coming out to on the streets and demanding, and they got some kind of a cash transfers. For example, the PM Kisan was immediately announced just before the elections, and some amount of money was also being given to them, although it stopped after the elections were over. Many state governments also announced, for example, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, and others announced loan waivers announced for the farmers. But all of these were basically going to people who were landed, people who had access to land. Whether it is, except for Orissa, which gave to landless laborers and agricultural laborers, most of them were given to farmers who had some kind of access to land or access to loan, which again is dependent on your access to land. So I think the section which really suffered, even with the revival measures or the measures to support the agriculture sector and the rural economy, were the landless laborers and the agricultural workers, the manual casual agricultural workers, and the tenant farmers, for which no schemes were more or less working. And this is something which is, again, they are at the receiving end of the entire spectrum. They are the ones who are going to lose job market, and they are there with the ability to work is already constrained. They're already in a very, very bad situation, and we don't have any social safety net for them. More dependent on, as far as when people who are dependent on agriculture is really a large part of the total economy, and therefore the impact that is going to be on our agricultural sector is much more difficult compared to what was there in the China. But China's recovery also has happened only after in a very, very recent recover from the loss of economic activity that has happened in the last 3 to 4 months. But I think one difference that is important is also to remember that in China it was localized, at least in the Hubei and the Wuhan province, it is farmers affected, but it was not something which led to a huge collapse in the economic activity. And even though China was also slowing down and we were also slowing down, we were in a much more precarious situation than China. So I don't think there is any comparison that is being made between China and India. But I think the causes which were leading to a decline in economic activity in India in the last 1.5 to 2 years were linked to the rural economy, to the agricultural economy, and that is why, for us, the revival of agriculture sector or agriculture rural economy is far more critical than it was in the case of China, which depends a lot on the export markets and the manufacturing activities. I think I don't know whether we can compare the numbers in terms of uh, percentage of GDP, but certainly, I mean, you're right on the fact that you mentioned about that Malaysia and others are spending 10% of the GDP, or even say, for example, Germany and US and most other countries are spending a large amount of money on fiscal stimulus. In UK and most of the countries have spent that much money for as part of the fiscal stimulus. You're right on those ones, and compared to that, I think India's fiscal stimulus is not even 0.5% of the GDP, even in fact lower than the that level of GDP. So I really is it's very difficult to imagine as to why there is a why the government has not yet opened up and has announced a much larger fiscal package. I mean, this, including opposition, I mean, most of the opposition parties have demanded this kind of a fiscal package, and we are seeing a situation where the government is not taking the course of fiscal stimulus. Uh, the question is not just the extent of it, but also the sense of urgency. It should be something that should be announced, should have been announced even before the lockdown started. But today, almost 10 days of the lockdown are over, and we still are far away from the government announcing any kind of a fiscal stimulus. And I think we are in a situation where whatever it takes strategy that we're talking about, that strategy is something which is necessary. I mean, this is not the time to talk about fiscal deficit. This is not the time to talk about fiscal prudence and talk about monetary policy and whether they're going to be effective. This is the time to really bring the stimulus and start on the stimulus as soon as possible. And if it takes a larger amount of money than what the government is initially planned, I think the government should do it because the cost of not doing is going to be much heavier. I mean, much larger in the long run, in a sense, because once the economy slips into a recession territory, then it requires a huge amount of effort to bring back the economy. Different recession territory, I think it will require a huge effort to bring it back to the level, and it will have a social and political context outcome. Uh, Outcome which are very difficult to predict, but it will have an impact on the social and political structure, which may be difficult to deal with. I think let me summarize the discussion, and I think the point is again just to uh, emphasize that the we are in a bad situation, and we were in a bad situation. Remember, and if we were in a bad situation, this outbreak and the response to this outbreak has actually led to a situation where the even the whatever little slim chances of recovery that we had, those have been pushed back by months, at least, if not by years. And at this point of time, I think the strategy is not very different from what the strategy that we were talking about, say, for example, 6 months or 1 year back, that you have to provide income support to the people who are in the rural areas or in the agricultural sector. And if that requires spending money, then I think the government should better spend money and should start spending money rather than making announcements which do not make any sense. Because those are the announcements, and some of the announcements were like usual routine announcements that were being made by the government as part of the fiscal package. They were not part of the fiscal package, and these were not I mean, only a small part was part of it. We really need government to spend money, provide income to the people in the rural economy, and agricultural incomes are going to increase only if the people who are in the non-agriculture sector are starting to beginning to start consuming goods and services which are produced by the agriculture sector. But if there is an overall decline in the economy, and overall incomes go down in the economy, and people are not consuming those goods and services, I mean, a lot of the service sector, for example, I mean, the hotels industry, restaurants, the dhabas, I mean, these are all dependent on agricultural commodities. And if the demand is for these goes down, then the demand for agricultural commodities also will go down. And once these commodities, the demand for these commodities go down, and you have, I mean, a lot of anecdotal stories have come out that how farmers are spilling milk in the street, people are simply destroying their produce, grapes have been destroyed, tomatoes have been destroyed, and various other crops have been destroyed. So the staying power in the agriculture sector is very low. We are talking about millions of farmers, millions of tiny households. 80% of them are really tiny households which will not be able to survive if they don't get their Rabi income, or they don't get the remunerative prices to continue even being in agriculture. And I think if that is the kind of a humanitarian scale that we're talking about, then the not working on agriculture, not supporting agriculture through the fiscal stimulus, the cost of that may be much more compared to the fear that we have on the number of deaths that the coronavirus will be inflicting on the discussion of how to revive agriculture. But the government should be putting the money upfront in reviving the agricultural economy or the rural economy. So if there are no more questions, I think we can conclude the discussion. Okay, thank you for being part of the discussion.